Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. Now, the big news in the archaeology world that broke a couple of months ago was the announcement of the discovery of a lead tablet from Mount Ebal. It has been covered in several large newspapers and has made the rounds on social media. The group that discovered this tablet has made some big claims about its implications. And if those claims are true, this would definitely be an earth-shattering find. Now, maybe you've seen news about this discovery and read articles or watched videos about it. Maybe you have questions. We definitely do. Now, if you aren't familiar with it, don't worry, we're going to catch you up. We'll look at some of the facts about this artifact as they stand, and some of the good, the bad, and the ugly about the artifact. Then we'll see what conclusions we can come to at this point. Let's dig in.
Let's establish some facts about this artifact first. First, we'll look at the original Mount Ebal excavations and results, and then we'll look at the fact pattern presented for this tablet. The site of Mount Ebal was first recognized as a site in a large survey of the hill country. It was then excavated by Adam Zertal from 1982 to 1989. The excavators identified two strata, or layers, at the site. Let me say now, no one has any real qualms with the actual excavations of the site. There are some disagreements about the site's interpretation, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The first, or older stratum, stratum 2, was dated to between 1240 to 1200 BC. This is based on some scarabs which date to late in the reign of Ramses the Great, as well as some ceramic forms and types common to late 13th century, like Mycenaean 3C ceramic sherds. The stratum had a structure, something the excavators note resembled a four-room or pillared-type house. Nearby they found several collard-rimmed pithoi, a kind of large ceramic storage vessel often linked with the Israelites. There was also a structure identified as cultic in nature that was built on the bedrock. It was about 2 meters in diameter and was filled with ash and animal bones, perhaps from sacrificial offerings. The second, or the newer stratum, stratum 1, is subdivided into stratum 1b and 1a, which follows stratum 2 without any major disruption. But the site still underwent a significant change. Over the earlier cultic structure, a second structure measuring 9 by 14 meters was built. Seems to have intentionally incorporated the earlier structure. It was intentionally filled over, had a stone pavement of sorts, and a ramp leading to the top of the new structure. The whole area was enclosed with a wall, sometimes called a temenos wall. The domestic type structure from stratum 2 was leveled, and it was converted into an open square. And inside the enclosure were 11 pits filled with ash, animal bones, and ceramic vessels. And outside of the enclosure were dozens more of these pits with more ash, animal bones, ceramic seals, and some metal objects. This stratum was dated to around 1200 to about 1130 BC, and it's this stratum, stratum 1b, that most people associate with Mount Ebal. The final stratum 1a is simply the abandonment of stratum 1b. The site was abandoned or went out of use, but it was not just left alone. It was sealed with a layer of stones, indicating some purposeful cessation of the site's use. It may have been sealed to keep it from being desecrated. So that's what the original excavators found. Their interpretation was that this structure was cultic, used for communal worship rituals, particularly the stratum 1b structure. They concluded that it must have served a large community because the enclosure was large and the structure was large and the amount of ash and animal bones was large, so the obvious connection was with Joshua, who renewed the covenant with the people of Israel at Mount Ebal. He built an altar of uncut stones, gathered the leaders of the communities, offered sacrifices, and Joshua read the law, the blessings and the curses, just as written in the book of the law. This stratum 1b structure was interpreted as that altar.
It's in this context that the newly discovered lead tablet comes into play. Now, in any excavation, there's a large amount of waste soil. You dig and remove the dirt to find what's in it and underneath it. And depending on the excavation, where you are in the excavation, and your sampling strategy, you will sift that dirt or a subset of it, and then it's all dumped into designated dump piles. This is standard archaeological practice. Adam Zertal's team at Mount Ebal understood that many important finds may still be in those dump piles, so some of that dirt was removed to different sites after the excavations concluded in the late 1980s. Now, with that in mind, Scott Stripling of the Associates of Biblical Research took the dump piles from Mount Ebal and sifted them. He used a wet sift technique that was used in the Temple Mount sifting project that he had previously worked on. That project was done after the Waqf, or the Islamic religious trust in charge of the Islamic holy sites in Jerusalem, removed 9,000 tons of soil from the Haram esh-Sharif, or Temple Mount, to build the El Marwani Mosque under the current ground level of the platform. That soil was removed and dumped where it was later sifted using this wet sift technique. Now, it's proven effective at finding small items which often are not picked up in initial excavations. Lots of stuff gets dumped because it can be hard to tell what's a clod of dirt and what's a seal with a little dirt adhering to it, or what's a figurine leg that's snapped off, and what's maybe just a little conical pebble. It can be hard to tell the difference. Now, this technique was used to sift the dump piles at Mount Ebal from Adam Zertal's excavation, and the finders have reported in a press conference that they found this lead tablet. It's small, only about 2 centimeters. It's made of lead that the team has said was sourced from the Aegean. It was ostensibly one flat piece of lead that was folded over onto itself. The tablet was not unfolded because it's very fragile, but instead it underwent tomographic scans in a lab in Prague, something like a CT scan. And from those scans, epigraphers noted about 40 signs in a script that they are calling Proto-Alphabetic Hebrew. They translated it to say this. Now, it's obviously a curse formula. It forms a chiastic structure, meaning the first and last lines parallel one another, the second and second to last parallel, and so on. This is a poetic form that mirrors the shape of the Greek letter chi. Now, it notably mentions the name Yahweh twice. Scott Stripling has stated that he believes the tablet dates to the late Bronze II, around 1400 BC. Okay, so what's good about this? Well, if the facts as presented are true, that would be incredibly good. This would be huge for our understanding of West Semitic language and writing. It would be huge for our understanding of the remains at Mount Ebal, since there are so many different interpretations of that site. It would be huge for our understanding of early Israel. It would be huge for our understanding of the development of Yahwism. But there's a long way to go before we get to definitive conclusions like that. So, what else is good? Well, we're a big proponent of reanalyzing old excavations and old excavation material. The field of archaeology has a bias towards what's new. New excavations, new perspectives, new interpretations. The newer the better, it seems, which on the one hand makes a lot of sense. The discipline moves forward in bigger ways when archaeologists are in the field digging up new material and adding to the data set. But archaeologists have been digging in the Near East for over 100 years, and there is a lot of material that they've uncovered. There are gems in old publications and museum storerooms that weren't recognized for their significance at the time that now could be analyzed in light of the 100 or so years of excavations since their discovery. The idea of going back through dump piles is a good one too. There are drawbacks that we'll get to in a moment, but there is no doubt a lot of interesting material that mistakenly got dumped the first time around that could be caught if it was looked at again. Now, this is a costly and a time-consuming process, and with limited resources, new excavations are probably a lot more cost-effective as far as moving the field forward. But this team is, in our opinion, commendable for looking at this material again.
While there's some good things with this tablet and the circumstances around it, there's also some bad. And I'll note now that not all of the bad stuff is the responsibility of the excavators, and this should not be held against them. First is the timing and the manner of the release. It was done at a press conference. Now, when you have a big find, it's not uncommon for the press to be notified. However, the best practice would be to run your tests, which they did, submit your findings to an academic journal, which I believe they have, and then have your findings reviewed by other experts in the field, which I'm sure is being done right now, and then the results are released. Well, that would be ideal. That is how this field and other scientific disciplines are supposed to work. And if you don't do that, and even when you do, you should at least present your findings at an academic conference, which I know they plan to do. Now, what I've heard is that there were rumors already spreading about the find and some unsanctioned photos were circulating, so in that case, it's understandable that they would want to put out an official statement. You can't move up the timeline for an academic conference, and peer review is notoriously slow-moving. The reviewer number 2 just never cooperates. So I understand some things were out of this team's control, and it's better to get ahead of the narrative when you have the data to do so than just to let rumors swirl. But if you're going to do that, you should also release more information than they did. You should release the data and not just your interpretation of it. The tomographic scans were already done, so where are they? When the picture's released, you can't see the inscription. It's on the inside of the folded lead. The scan images would let other experts take a look and offer other interpretations or confirm what was released. That would be a good thing. Drawings are interpretive, so having the actual scan images would be best. Another thing that isn't great, but is also out of their control, is the lack of context for this artifact. In archaeology, context is everything. Context drives interpretation, context drives pretty much everything, all the time. Given that this was found in the dump, there's no context beyond knowing which side it came from. We can't know which stratum this tablet came from, for example, and the fact that the dump piles were moved to another location before being sifted just compounds this problem. It's always best to find artifacts in situ, or in their original context, but you can't always get that. And even if you find something in a sift during excavation, you at least know where it came from, or which excavation area, which locus, and so on. This tablet doesn't have any of that. Thankfully, Ebal is only a 2-period site, so it likely dates to one of those periods, but we don't know which one. Unless the dump piles were contaminated after being moved, which is a whole other thing. We don't know if this tablet originally came from the earliest stratum or the latest. Did someone drop this as they were closing the site with a layer of stones in stratum 1A? Was it intentionally deposited in a pit during the heyday of the structure's use life in stratum 1B? Was it deposited during the earliest phases of the site in stratum 2? Which we don't know. We'll never know. Granted, we would never have known this tablet existed unless it was found during the initial excavation, so having it now gives us more information than before. So kudos to the team that did the work and actually found this. But we don't have the context we need to really understand what it is and how it was used. All we can do is look to similar artifacts that were found in their context and assume this artifact had a similar use.
Alright, so now we get to the ugly. If the bad was largely out of the hands of the finders of this tablet, the ugly is much more under their control. From where we're sitting, a lot of the ugly here has to do with the interpretations and understandings of the significance of this tablet. Now again, some of this isn't the excavator's responsibility, but some of it is. This story has generated a lot of press, and several journalists have written pieces about this artifact. Now, a broader problem with journalism in this day and age is that journalists need clicks. They want people to find their article and click on it and drive traffic, so there's an incentive to push some of the more fantastic claims or potentialities around this artifact. So, be careful if you read some of these articles, and recognize that the authors of these articles aren't experts on this subject. And we can hope they're trying their best to accurately report on it. But they also need a story. They need clicks, and they're going to push as far as they can with what they've got. So, readers, be wary. But we should also note that journalists are writing their pieces based on what the finders have said, both in public statements and in interviews. Now, some of what's been said about this artifact is suspect. These claims range from the more pedantic things like calling this proto-alphabetic Hebrew to serious misstatements such as that this has huge implications for the story of the Exodus. Let's take a look at just a couple of these claims.
First, this proto-alphabetic Hebrew claim. A Hebrew inscription presupposes a Hebrew language and Hebrew speakers, and this presupposes a differentiation between Hebrew and other Canaanite dialects at this stage of alphabetic development. Calling this proto-alphabetic Hebrew is presupposing a long chain of developments that may or may not be accurate. It may seem pedantic or nitpicky, but with an artifact of this magnitude, we should expect some precision. If it's Hebrew, let's have an explanation as to how we know it's Hebrew and not another Canaanite dialect. Other epigraphers have looked at the translation given by the team and have noted that the words used appear in other Semitic languages. There aren't really any Hebrew-specific vocabulary words used, not even Yahweh. The language in this tablet doesn't need to be Hebrew, so is it proto-alphabetic Hebrew or proto-alphabetic Canaanite? I've also seen other claims, mostly on social media, about how this artifact has huge implications for the dating of the Exodus, or that it clearly shows that there was literacy in Hebrew in the Late Bronze Age, so that means the Pentateuch could clearly be written by Moses in the Late Bronze Age, and this in turn negates the documentary hypothesis, which suggests the Pentateuch specifically, but the Old Testament in general, came together in a relatively long and slow process which incorporated numerous traditions and ideas. None of these claims are true. None of them. At this point, I think it's worth quoting the prominent archaeologist Israel Finkelstein. In a social media post, he said something that I agree with wholeheartedly. At the end of his post, he says this: In general, I am irritated by sensational claims on discoveries which ostensibly change everything we know about the Bible and the history of ancient Israel in one blow. What we know can be compared to a pyramid standing on its base rather than on its tip ready to collapse. And he is completely right. Issues around the Exodus involve vast data sets, and your perspective on the Exodus largely depends on how you weigh various aspects of those data sets. If you think it was an historical event, you would look to settlement and demographic shifts in the late 13th and early 12th centuries. You'd look at the emergence of a distinct material cultural assemblage that went along with that shift. If you see it as more of a literary thing, you would point to continuity in the material culture and the lack of clear evidence out of Egypt for an Exodus event. But both perspectives must account for all of the data, and the data available here are huge. And we have a whole series on the Exodus you can check out here. But even then, we just scratched the surface on this topic. This tablet may be one more tool to use, but it isn't a silver bullet that should sway our entire understanding of the Exodus one way or the other.
The same is true for the documentary hypothesis. Now, since Julius Wellhausen posited the theory of multiple documents discernible in the Pentateuch almost 150 years ago, there have been probably millions of pages of academic work going back and forth arguing the merits for and against various elements of the model. It has evolved and changed over the years. I don't think anyone alive accepts the documentary hypothesis as Wellhausen originally posited it, but that's because it's been tested and refined so that current perspectives on the text rest on much more solid evidentiary grounds. A single lead tablet simply can't undo all of that work. The premises of the veracity of this tablet and the current iterations of the documentary hypothesis are not so at odds with one another that one invalidates the other. And then as far as the dating of the tablet, Scott Stripling is quoted as saying he thinks it may be as early as 1400 BC. But that's a problem, unless you are making the archaeological data fit your particular interpretation of the textual data. Zertal dates the site to the second half of the 13th century at the earliest, meaning 1250 to 1200 BC. Stripling's dating of the tablet would predate the rest of the remains of the site by a wide margin. Zertal's dating of the site is based on its ceramic assemblage, which is how dating is done for these periods. Other sites have similar ceramic assemblages with radiocarbon dates in the same stratum that date to the 11th century. So some archaeologists think it's possible that Mount Ebal needs to be downdated to the 11th century, although it seems most scholars still see it as a mostly 12th century site. But even if they see it as a 12th century site, there is no agreement on what it is. Amahai Mazar does accept this as an Israelite cultic shrine. Israel Finkelstein has as well, but he rejects that it is an altar, let alone Joshua's altar. André Lemaire accepts it as vaguely cultic, but he doesn't go much further than recognizing its cultic qualities. Michael David Coogan accepts it as a cultic site, but doesn't see it necessarily as Israelite. Aharon Kempinski, Anson Rainey, and Bill Deaver all rejected the cultic association of the site altogether, instead seeing it as a watchtower or an isolated farmhouse. Nadav Naaman has suggested that this is not Joshua's altar, but the so-called Tower of Shechem. Now, for those of you not familiar with Near Eastern archaeology, those are some big names in the field, and they all have slightly different interpretations of this one site. So, the Mount Ebal site has a contested history of interpretation. To say definitively that this is Joshua's altar is to favor one among many plausible interpretations. This doesn't even necessarily seem to be the most plausible interpretation of the site. The whole site may not be cultic at all. So to build your interpretation of this tablet, which came from somewhere on the site, from some time at the site, on one particular interpretation among many, is at best risky and at worst irresponsible. It gives the impression to people reporting on the find and trying to understand it that this is the only possible conclusion, and that this find supports a host of other claims when nothing could be further from the truth. So where does that leave us? Well, first of all, be cautious, not just with this find, but with any archaeological find, especially ones that make the news like this one. Now, these finds don't come out of a vacuum, and as interesting as exciting as these press releases may be, there's usually a lot of background information that doesn't make for an exciting press release or news article, but is nevertheless important to fully understand an artifact. Now, we recognize, and we even hope, that the facts as stated could all be true, but they might not be. And that's not to say the excavators are trying to trick you or fool you. We think they genuinely believe the claims they're making. But we also think there are a lot of problems with those claims when it comes to both method and interpretation. With a proto-alphabetic script, even under the best circumstances, it sometimes takes some squinting and creative thinking to see all of the signs and symbols, let alone to do that in a digital scan of folded lead. So, this may turn out to be a huge, amazing find that has significant implications for understanding the Iron One period. Or it may not. It'll take some time to find out. Even if the claims about the text end up being true, the implications that have already been drawn about it can't be supported by a single artifact like this. Good scholarship takes time. Now, I'm sure the excavators in this case would have liked to have done it all a bit differently, but they were forced by circumstances to take a less optimal route to disclosing their findings. It happens. But now it's important to let the slow wheels of scholarship turn. It'll take time for peer review to finish. It'll take time for Stripling's team to present their findings at conferences, and for the academic community to review it, to respond, and to offer alternatives or affirmations, or whatever is necessary. But it will take time. So in the meantime, by all means, we would encourage you to share the news of this find with your friends. It's really cool. But when you do, maybe tell them to take the conclusions out there with a grain of salt. This is a lead tablet, not a silver bullet. It isn't going to prove or disprove your favorite interpretation of the Exodus or the documentary hypothesis or whatever else is being put on this little piece of metal. If you want to argue for an early date or for the Exodus or against the documentary hypothesis, then by all means, go for it. But interact with all the data so that your argument stands. As Finkelstein said, the discipline of archaeology is built on a mountain of data accumulated year by year, excavation after excavation. Now, while the mainstream does get things wrong, the course correction usually comes with the accumulation of even more data. This tablet, as cool as it is just one more pebble on that mountain. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you liked what you saw, be sure to give this video a like and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. You can also follow us on social media, on Twitter and Facebook at Beneath the Bible. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.